For tonight, we're going to be focusing on reconnecting the histories of our community, and we have a fantastic panel here tonight to talk a little bit about their experiences. And I'm going to let Lynn introduce them, but I will first introduce Lynn Johnson, who's our moderator for tonight. Lynn specializes in African American literature, African aesthetics, and Africana literary cultures. Her primary research interests are in African American literary production and theory, and the Middle Passage studies. Currently, she is completing a manuscript that examines the relationship between food and psychological disease and wellness as portrayed in African American fiction. So I will hand it over to Lynn.
Good to see so many of you out here joining us for this really great discussion. As Lindsay said, we have panelists that are really outstanding. I was just reading a lot about them over the last couple of weeks, and I'm so excited to learn more about their stories and how we as a community can come together to preserve some of these stories. So I would like to start by introducing Margaret Barksdale. We're going to go from this side to this side. So we have Margaret Barksdale. She is a local historian, writer, genealogist, who is also known affectionately as the Cemetery Lady because of her caretaking of the historic Midland Cemetery, the resting place of slaves, free men, United States colored troops, Buffalo soldiers, Tuskegee airmen, and numerous leaders of the area's African American community. The cemetery is located in Swatara Township. In addition, Barbara is the founder and the president of the Friends of Midland and is the current chair for the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds Project, an aid to caretakers, historians, students, and anyone who's interested in caretaking and restoring their local cemeteries. She has been actively involved with the exposure of local Black history, has brought reenactors of the United States colored troops and the Buffalo soldiers to the area during the Midland Memorial Day celebrations and to area schools for special programs. Under her leadership, Friends of Midland has received the Pennsylvania Preservation Award from the State Museum Commission for their restoration efforts, and she has also won numerous awards from Pennsylvania Governors Tom Ridge and Ed Rendell, state senators, the Stilton Borough, for her conservation efforts. The next panelist is Tatyum Robinson. Tatyum grew up in Carlisle and is a junior at Carlisle High School. She is a member of Hope Station's Youth Leadership Program as well as the Carlisle Area Youth Council. Tatyum has gained experience in historical research as part of a class at Dickinson College, where she learned how to do research at the Cumberland County Historical Society. It is through this she's learned the value of students' stories, and this has led to her and other students during projects that she has been able to articulate to the school board. Next we have Carmen Jones. Carmen Jones is a founding member of the Mount Tabor Preservation Project, an initiative to restore Mount Tabor A&E Zion Church, which was founded by Elias Parker in Mount Holly Springs in 1870. Carmen and her family moved to Mount Holly Springs in 1951, and shortly thereafter met and developed relationships with the Gumby family, who are descendants of Elias Parker. It was during this time that she and her family also began attending Mount Tabor Church. Although James left Mount Holly Springs in 1969, she continued to maintain ties with her home and church communities. Her retirement from a career in banking in Philadelphia led her back home and to her church community. So it was because of a conversation with David Toner after she returned and Pam Still that facilitated their journey towards preserving Mount Tabor Church. Brenda Barrett is the editor of Living Landscape Observer, a website and monthly newsletter providing commentary on land conservation, historic preservation, and sustainable communities. She is the former Director of Recreation and Conservation at the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and has held positions as the National Coordinator for historic areas for the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., and as the Director of the Historic Preservation at the, Historic Preservation at the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. Scott LaMar is a native of Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and has maintained a career in radio and television for more than 40 years. Currently, he is host and executive producer of the daily Smart Talk News and Public Affairs program on WITF 89.5 FM and 93.3 FM. Under Lamar's leadership as executive producer, Smart Talk has won more than a dozen Pennsylvania Associated Press broadcast awards. In addition, he was a recipient of ADVOC Lancaster's first ever Dignity in Dialogue Award and was named humanitarian hero by the Humane Society of the United States. Notably, while serving as WITF TV's senior public affairs producer, LaMar was nominated for 5 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for his production of the weekly public affairs TV programs, as well as other statewide and regional programs. I cannot forget Richard Utley. Richard Utley is a nationally renowned author, publisher, speaker, trainer, and facilitator. He has had a positive influence on the community, which includes several ventures to promote enrichment and entertainment in and around the tri-state area. He's a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he received his degree in communications from the University of Pittsburgh. He is retired from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where he served for over 20 years in high-level management positions prior to becoming the Deputy of Administration in the Office of the Department of the Auditor General. Richard was also a lobbyist for Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. In his professional employment, Richard served as a mentor, confidant, and manager in administration within local and state governments. He is clearly an advocate for the remembrance of Black history locally and nationally. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists. So I'm going to give each of the panelists some time to introduce their particular project and interest in historic preservation, starting with Barbara.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you, Lindsay, and everyone for Cumberland County Historical Society for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And Dr. Johnson, I have to say, thank you very much. As she had introduced me, I am known as the cemetery lady, and that is because I've been out there taking care of cemeteries. Believe it or not, for the last 29 years. And because of that great effort of myself, along with so many other people that has helped me, held me up, taking care of different things with me, I am now able to help with the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds Project, which is also taken care of. Right now we have about 42 cemeteries that we're actively involved in and trying to make sure that we not only restore the cemetery, but preserve it, and more importantly, use it for educational purposes. What we have done over the last 10 years or so, we have tried to replicate what I have already done with the Midland Cemetery. We started out with a cemetery that's full of weeds and trees and just totally forgotten. And within this massive mess of foliage was a lot of wonderful people that was just waiting to get out and have a voice. And I hopefully have created a voice for them by bringing forth not only their headstones, but also their stories. And we have been able to, use the cemetery, like I said, for educational purposes. We found out that we had slaves that had been buried there, like in Midland Cemetery, and as well as other cemeteries. But we also were targeting cemeteries that held the bodies of the United States colored troops. And you can't have the United States colored troop without having somebody that was maybe related to that person. Maybe their parents, their father, their mother, more than likely, or even another sibling. Maybe it was their wife or their children. So when I go after cemeteries with the USCT buried in them as the United States colored troops, I'm also looking to find out what about their relatives, their person that they were loving or loved to or loved by. I look for not only the USCT, but also the Buffalo Soldier. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about the Buffalo Soldier one way or the other, the American Indians, especially being in Carlisle. We also have, not only in these cemeteries, but we also have the Tuskegee Airmen. And in many cases, we have a unit called the Murphy Point Marines. Many people have never heard of them. And with us going out there to restore and preserve these here wonderful cemeteries that have been forgotten, these stories are coming to light. So we're able to connect not only the not so much dead people, but we're able to connect those people to living people, their descendants, and let them know about the wonderful history of what these people have done for not only their own family, but for the United States of America and abroad. Because no matter how you look at it, there's always going to be somebody who is connected to someone else. And that's what we have been able to do in the restoration of the cemeteries. It is so important for us to document, and I do hope that we're in this wonderful place of history over here called Carlisle, that you will be using the people that you have here, like the students, to document the histories that you have here, which is so, so important. But it also helps us to expand on what you maybe are using as a foundation to add on to those people that are buried there. For instance, like at my cemetery, Midland Cemetery in Whitehurst Township, I have uncovered just recently through documentation and digging and research and all, a person that never had a headstone by the United States of America. They just never had one. What I found was a headstone that was made out of cement, and the family actually scratched in their name. What I started really digging into was the fact that, hey, this man was a USCT. So now my quest is to make sure that we get a proper headstone for Mr. Washington Jordan. And nobody knew about his history. So now my next quest is to make sure that I contact his family and let them know that they had somebody who was a USCT. And if they dig even further into this history and shake off the dust from these headstones, you're also going to end up finding that, oh, they came from slaves. Or maybe they came from free people. Maybe they have a cousin that's sitting out here right now. You just never know. And don't look at yourself as just being just white, because you could be one of us, you know what I'm saying? You see that all the time. You know, I have some cousins that passed too, you know. So one of my cousins is sitting out there. But the main thing is that we truly do try to use the PA Hallowed Grounds to contact people, the caretakers, to give them support, to give them the needs that they, the tools they need to have in order to do the restoration, to try to proclaim that they are taking care of that bit of property, which is so very, very important, that the cemeteries are not left under the trees and the weeds and also the streets or somebody's Walmart or somebody's Staples or just on the highways, because you know they have kind of shoved them under the roads and just kept on going. So it's very important that we take care of everybody, past and present, and make sure that we do protect our history as well as use every bit of this for educational purposes.
Hi everybody, my name is Tatyum. And about 2 years ago, I took a Dickinson course studying the African American history in Carlisle. And I'm actually taking it again this year to sort of further understand our complex history. And in our history, it was surprising to me to find the presence of slavery. And even though because we were above the Mason-Dixon line, most people think that there wasn't slavery when there actually was. Cumberland County was actually the last county in Pennsylvania to abolish slavery in 1847. So, of course, even after that, there was still segregation in our schools and housing until 1948, when the elementary schools were finally integrated. There was also a lot of redlining, which was the legal practice of not allowing loans and plots of land to be sold to Black people. And that's why we currently have our predominantly low-income neighborhoods, which are disproportionately African American, which is around the Hope Station area. And for those of you who don't know where that is the North Street, Pitt Street, Lincoln Street area. So when you see minorities concentrated in low-income areas without context, people tend to make assumptions and generalizations without knowing the history behind it. So how has our history affected us today? In my personal experience as a high school student, there is still much to be done with regards to race relations and knowing how to handle racially charged instances. I've listened to my peers and actually wrote a letter to the school board to initiate racial sensitivity training in the school district for first faculty and then eventually 2 students. So just as a quick summary of how that would happen, it's over a course of 3 days. A moderator comes in and leads discussions about race, examining the participants' feelings and advancing the discussion and bringing together people with a better understanding of each other. So without Miss Afrania and Miss Lindsay, I wouldn't have known my local history and taken the Dickinson course, which is so clearly important to understand the world we live in today. So my call to action for you guys is to push that agenda to the school board, just trying to get our study circles kind of to them so that they can think about it and initiate it to the school board. So, yeah.
Good evening. My name is Carmen James, and I come from a little town 6 miles from here called Mount Holly Springs. The population of Mount Holly Springs is a little over 2,000. I live on a street called Mountain Street, and some of you are nodding because you've visited our church. I went to a church called Mount Tabor. It was established by Reverend Parker back, we think, around circa 1870, but we're beginning to believe that it might be a little bit earlier. Okay. The reason I'm here tonight is to talk about how that street that once had at least 100 people living on it, how it changed, how people moved away, and ironically, how people moving back and new people moving into Mount Holly has started to establish the history that was missing. For Mount Tabor, most of the history that we have is oral history. It came from the Gumby family. They were related to Reverend Parker. He was Mr. and Mrs. Gumby. I used to call them Grandma Gumby and Grandpa Gumby. They were Grandma Gumby's, he was Grandma Gumby's father. He was a former enslaved person who was a United States colored troop member. The cemetery that's attached to the Mount Tabor Church has 7 of those veterans. And I'm very proud of it, and I know I always say, Lindsay rolls her eyes when I say, we have 7 USCT troops in our little cemetery. And I know other cemeteries have more than that, but when you look at the town that I live in, 2,000 plus, having 7, I'm very proud of that. When I was young, I didn't realize the significance of that. But as I went out, lived in Philadelphia for over 30 years and worked in a bank, and listened to stories from other people, and living in a town close to Philadelphia, or living close to Philadelphia, knowing the history that they have and how proud they are. Our 7, I'm very proud of them. I'm proud of our church. I invite all of you to come see. It's in rough shape, but it's loved. I always say that. We give tours. In fact, we had a tour on Monday. Lindsay drives her little bus, and she brings people out to our church to visit. We're now just starting the Mount Tabor Preservation Project. It's a new little group that we hope to expand as we go forward, and we're looking at what we can do to help the church. The church has no owner, so we're sort of the caretakers of the church at this particular point in time. The cemetery that's attached to it, we've done a lot of work, and we're very proud of that work. But we have more work because there's a cemetery that's even older than that, that's located on private property, that in our 2019 goals, we hope to find that cemetery and also recognize the people that are buried there. I remember that cemetery as a young girl because that was the first funeral that I ever saw. The first person that I ever knew as a small child dying and being buried was in that cemetery. So it has a lot of history that we're hoping to uncover. And I invite all of you to come to Mount Holly Springs, see our cemetery, see our church, and become a volunteer. We would love to have you pull weeds with us. Pull poison ivy. And help us decide what is the best course for the church, because we have a lot of ideas and a lot of plans, and we need to sit down and focus and decide what's the best thing that we can do for our church. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm on a mission, and I'm going to put you on that mission as well. How many of us were not afforded opportunities to read or have someone read about accomplishments of positive stories about African Americans? Books were written that portrayed slaves as loving old master, yet our families were sold. We worked from sunup to sundown, and yet we were described as lazy. That's why our story has to be told. That's why it's very important for all of you to open up, do research, and talk about it. Carter Woodson once said, "Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished loses the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biographic and history." That's very important. And so my stay in life at this point is to try to help young people as well as older people to understand the plight and the accomplishments that African Americans have done in America. African Americans participated in every war, all the way from the Revolutionary War all the way up. But yet when I watch TV, and I'll give you an example, I dedicated a journal to my father called Blacks Who Served in World War II. Let me tell you why. Because as I sit there and I watch Patton, I didn't see any black folks. But yet there was a 761st Battalion of the Black Panthers. Think about that. I didn't see any. If I looked at the Battle of the Bulge, I didn't see any of us. But yet as a little kid, I grew up, I had the little plastic green men, I played Army, because I thought I was a part of the whole thing. But yet when I look at TV, there's none of us. So I made it my value that I was going to go around and tell folks what we have accomplished. We have accomplished a lot, and I want to put it in perspective for you tonight. Think about this. I dedicated to my father, and my father served in World War II. Keep this in mind. The Army was segregated up until 1948, which meant that African Americans fought in every war, and when they got home, they had to go back to the reality of segregation. So just think how they were willing to put their life on the line for America. So my thing is to give you some little bit of history. I'm probably sure if I say to you Dr. Charles Drew, many of you may know who Dr. Charles Drew is. Dr. Charles Drew is the doctor that developed the plasma to separate the blood. Do you know how that happened? I'm going to tell you how it happened. During World War II, when America called for everyone to give blood, black folks got in line, white folks got in line. But only black folks get black blood, and only white folks get white blood. That might sound crazy to you, but that's the way it really was. But yet here's the man who developed plasma, and we all are able to have blood transfusions because of him. Those things have to be told because that will also give kids, especially African American kids, positive role models. They always see the negative. A lot of you always see the negative. So I think it's time for all of us to share the positiveness of how African Americans have played a great, great role in America. We talked about the Tuskegee Airmen. Everybody in here knows about the Tuskegee Airmen. But how many of you know this? When he got back to New York, one sign said color, one sign said white. Yet they fought. Yet we talk about them and we're very proud of them. Many of them, I'm quite sure all of you know, could not be pilots at that point in time because of racism. Racism was very prevalent, and the point is, if we don't talk about our history, and if we don't share our history, and if we don't have candid conversations about our history, where's it going to go? Because as I continue to tell the story of my father, I realize that people like him, they're either no longer here, or they can't really remember what took place back then. So it's my responsibility, and it's your responsibility, to give the real picture of history. And I know I hear these comments about why do we have Black history. It's not that we wanted to have Black history, but keep this in mind. History was separated from us. So if we want to be honest and we want to be candid, we can put it all together. But I think at the same time, I would ask you in this community to find positive role models and positive things of African Americans and share it with your family and share it with the kids, because they need to have positive role models, but they also need to know that somebody was a trailblazer for them. So again, I say to all of you, I'm on a mission, so I put all of you on the mission. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to come here tonight. But the most important thing, if you don't hear anything else I say tonight, is that history is important, and we need to share it. Whether it's good, whether it's bad, or whether it's indifferent. And I think that as we all in this room are very wise and very intelligent, I think that's been one of the real problems of America at this point. We haven't really wanted to really deal with the real issues and the roots and the causes of where we are today. Thank you.
Well, in my long career, I've had such a wonderful experience, both working in historic preservation and being able to drive into a town and identify the squares and the important elements to the community, the churches, the schools, and then in working for the National Park Service and working for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, I took a slightly different perspective, looking at the outdoors, looking at the trails, looking at the recreational facilities, being able to read the landscape that way. And here in Cumberland County, you have some amazing landscapes to read. You have the Appalachian Trail slashing across Cumberland County, and the midpoint of the trail is right here. This is the center of an incredible story. You have up on the South Mountain some of the earliest conservation heritage in Pennsylvania. This was we call it the cradle of conservation. These were where the ideas of state parks and state forests were tried out and created. This is where the first forestry school was set up. So this is really a landscape with many different stories. But today I just want to talk a little bit particularly about African American history, because reading the landscape is something I think we should all be able to do and all really dig into. But African American history and reading the landscape, particularly from a cemetery perspective, and we heard quite a bit of that already tonight, is, I think, very telling. There are there's Lincoln cemeteries throughout central Pennsylvania, and they're always African American cemeteries, and they were named after the great President Lincoln and the heroism and the stories that he represented to the community. But what has happened to those cemeteries today? One of them is a very small little rural cemetery off Winding Hill Road. That little Lincoln Cemetery has, 9, 10 USCT burials in it. It's a community burial site. And yet, when you go to that little cemetery, and I go there every Memorial Day, it tells you a story. First of all, it's owned by maybe the farmer who has the land, because property ownership is so challenging for the African American community that the cemetery is just there and totally at risk. It's also right across the street from the Chestnut Hills, a large upscale Chestnut Hill cemetery with massive monuments in it, because cemeteries were segregated. So here, that cemetery is already telling you a story of people who had no property, a story of folks that had very little funding, very little money. Most of the cemetery stones, the most prominent ones are the ones that were given by the War Department for veterans. And it's telling you a story of segregation. And then right down the street here at Hope Station, there's an even more devastating story at Memorial Park. And I don't know, most of you probably know the story of Memorial Park. That park was once a very large African American cemetery, Lincoln Cemetery. And there was, when Carlisle was established, a white cemetery was established and a black cemetery was established. White cemetery is going strong. The black cemetery is now, most of the story has been erased and it was turned into a park by my old agency. I pulled out the files. It wasn't that long ago. It was in, the 70s, in the 80s. We were pulling up the gravestones and turning it into, quote, a park. So I think that tells you again a story, a very difficult story, but a very important story. And I'm excited to hear that in Carlisle, that story is going to be revived, and we're going to actually go back and try to retell history and reestablish the history of that particular site. So I think I want to conclude just by saying the landscape has so much to tell us about race, about gender, about property, about power, and about the resilience of people who care, and about patriotism. So keep your eyes open. There's so much to learn from looking at the landscape.
Hi, I'm Scott LaMar. I host the WITF Smart Talk program on WITF FM every morning. Before I start, what I'm addressing is getting history noticed, history publicized, history coverage in the media. I'll be talking about that in just a moment, but I have to say that the potluck dinner, a few people laughed at that. We do a program before the holidays every year, and one of the most popular suggestions is this is how they hand down one of their oral histories, is to hand down recipes from their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-grandparents, if you will, if they were around when they were children. That it's the kind of conversation starter about history that a lot of families have. Is, started with a meal, a holiday meal, and traditions, and that's how you talk about your family history. But what I'm here tonight to talk about is media coverage and history. I don't have to tell most of you, but traditional media, there are a lot fewer, put it that way, traditional media outlets than there used to be. There are very few counties, towns, cities that have newspapers, daily newspapers today. Cumberland County is very fortunate. Carlisle is very fortunate in that the Sentinel is here on a daily basis. Not a lot of places have that anymore. The Sentinel is a quality newspaper. Commercial radio stations don't have local news staff, so you're not probably going to get a story about history from your commercial radio station. TV stations will notice every once in a while if there's something unique. But for the most part, the traditional media is not doing many stories that focus on history unless there's something unique. I will say that Black History Month is one of the times that the media does pay attention. Now, that's good and bad. Bad because it takes 1 month out of the year that they have to do it. But I had an African American woman point out to me last week that Black History Month is the shortest month of the year. Yeah, so it was only 28 days for that month. But there is media that will be interested in a story about history. Just kind of some thoughts I have on that. In today's media landscape, I don't have to tell you that, I don't know, maybe I do have to tell you that in my 40 years of broadcast journalism, I have never seen a news landscape like we're in today. Much of that has to do with what's coming out of Washington. There's a different bombshell every day, which crowds out the front pages, page 2, 3, 4, 5, the editorial pages of almost every newspaper. What that does is it keeps a lot of newspapers from writing about other topics. Other radio stations, TV stations, doing the same thing. I mean, you may not be directly impacted by what's happening in Washington, but because of these bombshells, there usually is a local impact, and the local media is covering those. So, what's happening in Washington right now, and really around the country, is crowding out a lot of what local media normally would do. But I had an experience just last weekend that, I don't know, kind of restored my faith in people, Americans. It goes along the lines of a lot of the things we've heard here tonight. Last weekend at Midtown Scholar Bookstore in Harrisburg, I interviewed two authors, a husband and wife, James and Deborah Fallows. James Fallows is well known as a writer for The Atlantic. They wrote a book called Our Town's 100,000-Mile Journey into the Heart of America. What they did from 2012 to 2016 was they traveled around America to different cities and towns. Most of these places had made comebacks, that they were doing something that had made them successful again. They were bringing visitors in, they were creating jobs, there were more people moving or staying in these places. One of the things that they said that they noticed was between 2012 and mid-2016 that people did not bring up national issues, that they talked about what was happening in their communities. And whether they were Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, they worked together because they had pride in their communities. Now, they said they noticed a change in like mid-2016 as the election was heating up. People started talking more about national issues. But they said it was very noticeable that in those 3.5 years before that people wanted to talk about what was common to them, what they all kind of could relate to, and they all cooperated. A lot of it had to do with community pride. I think they traveled over 100,000 miles. I think they visited 36 cities, something like that. The majority of them came up with projects, their assets, that were positive. Much of it had to do with history. They took advantage of their history because no matter how small we think stories may be, whether they're black, white, whatever, that people liked hearing about their history. And they took pride in their communities. And these communities that staged comebacks took advantage of that history to bring people in to learn about it. And they cooperated. So that said a lot to me was, I learned something that people are not, as much as we think this country is divided, that maybe we are national issues, but between neighbors, there's a lot of things that pull us together, and history is one of those things. Shared history, whether it's good or bad, but that shared history is a sense of pride and brings a lot of people together. Now, I see Kathy standing, sorry. But anyway, just want to say that the traditional media is not a great outlet. One thing I will some tips on trying to get noticed in the media, something that is unique and innovative. All these towns and cities that they talked about had something innovative and unique. Barbara Barksdale has been a guest on my program. One of the reasons was what she did was unique, talking about the cemeteries, cleaning up the cemeteries, the United States color trips. That was unique. It brought people out. It brought people together. Those are the kind of things that will get the media to notice. But I'll also say one other thing, and that is, don't wait for the media to notice you. Go to them with stories. Stories about people, not dates, not necessarily events, but stories about the people of your community. Stories are what sell. Sorry about that.
So what we can gain from what our panelists have already said is how do we get people interested in the story? How do we get our citizens invested in the story? So I want to ask the other panelists, how do you get people to take notice so that they will invest in your initiatives? So Barbara, you've been involved in cemetery work for a long time. What were some of the challenges that you had in getting people to understand the significance of your work?
Well, I've been blessed. I have been truly blessed. When I started the project, like I said, about 29 years ago, I was told when I went on the property that if I was to do anything to it, they were going to put me in jail. And that's because they had already condemned the cemetery so that they could sell the land or use the land to put houses on it. They were going to remove the bodies, which included my grandparent, my grandfather, and they were going to remove everybody and use the land, because it's a good site. It's up on the top of a piece of a mountain. You can see over the Camp Hill. It's really nice. Well, so what I did, I went public. I got to one of the township's meetings, and they happened to have the media there. And I got up and I spoke up about the property and my grandparent, and next thing you know, I got everybody to pitch in to help. And that's what took off. So I said, put me in jail, okay? They didn't want to put me in jail. So it got things moving. And ever since then, it's been constantly an influx of people that want to help me. And I'm sure that the other cemeteries, like Tabor's, Mount Tabor's and such, because you're out there, you're doing something, and you're doing something positive, with the help of the Cumberland County Historical Society, that people will come and help, which they are doing.
Carmen, can you also share your experiences in getting people to notice, and you've already asked people to help?
We've been very lucky. We started out, and I heard you mention stories. We started out with stories. Pam Still was a local individual that was collecting stories in Mount Holly and stumbled across the Mount Tabor Church. And then Lindsay was collecting stories for Heart and Soul. So the stories got out there. People started listening to the stories, and we actually received phone calls from places like Home Depot saying, what can we do to help? We received phone calls from Senator Reagan saying, what do you need? Come to my office. I don't want any publicity. This is just something I want to help you with. And we ended up getting a fence. We ended up, through him, working with Mike Kennedy from Allenbury, getting the holes in our roof fixed, the trees off the top of the roof. And actually, once our story got out there, from stories that were being told, we had a number of people just make phone calls and say, hey, we want to help. And those calls still continue to happen, and we'll take them, keep coming.
So part of our storytelling is to kind of figure out what are some truths about a particular place, a particular historical event. How do you fight off what Chimamanda Adichie, the novelist, says, the dangers of a single story, where we're only focusing on one person's perspective about a story while ignoring others? How have you all, I should say, used story to push back against one person's version of a story? Because if we think about it, our own upbringing in schools, you might only hear about slavery from a negative, point of view. How do we push back against those one-sided views? Brenda?
Well, I don't know if this solves the one-sided viewpoint completely, but my experience as Pennsylvanians is they're kind of show-me people. They like to see things. So when people go out and see things on the ground, when they can see the contrast between an African-American burial ground and the issues they're facing and the white cemeteries across the street or up the hill, that makes it's a real visual lesson. I think anyone who's been to Mount Tabor is, as soon as they see that church and see that cemetery, it moves their spirit. When you go to Midland and hear the story of what it was, see the pictures of what it was like and how wonderful it looks today, I think that the idea of taking people out and showing them is a very powerful lesson.
Just to quickly follow up with you, Brenda, you talked about how we can read stories in the landscape. How do you teach us how to do that?
Well, I teach a whole class on that at Johns Hopkins. But no, I think again, it's a matter of getting out there and looking. And of course, I also love old maps too. I think old maps are wonderful. But I think walking around, looking, just how many people just seeing those signs for the Appalachian Trail? And then doesn't that stir your imagination? And you just want to put on your backpack and so I think again, and then if you know what the backstory is behind that, it becomes even richer. So the more we can get out and tour around, and again, Lindsay running those bus tours is a great idea.
I'll give you an example. Because I did, she wants to get up with me.
Any other questions?
Well, no, I have a request.
Oh, okay.
Can you give the group a kind of a trailer teaser of what the project?
Oh, yeah. I feel like Carrie should do that. I'm going to put her on the spot since it's her project.
Unless someone on the panel
So the Lincoln Cemetery Project, which has been something I've wanted to do for, no, I understand it, the speaker, quite some time. We've been at the Historical Society for 10 years now, and I think we're finally in a place where we can move forward. And I wanted to do a web-based project so it's accessible to everyone, and knowing that families have left the area. And something tangible, since the site is no longer, you don't walk into that space and think cemetery anymore. So we've been actively going down what I call my rabbit holes and looking at the deeds and trying to find the history of the site, because the site history is not clear. Obviously, it's an African-American cemetery, but when was it started? There's a lot of questions, so that's going to be a component. And various other stories about the Jordan headstone and the fight to keep a headstone there will be a component of that, so there'll be different stories. Lindsay's going to write something on, the Pennsylvania has very few cemetery protections, that if it's privately owned, you can destroy a cemetery. So we want to highlight that as part of this. It's bigger than Lincoln. And Lincoln is not unique in that other cemeteries were destroyed in the 70s and other time periods, that this is a problem. It could be a problem again. Hopefully people take action and stop things from happening, but it could happen again. So we want to make that clear. And maybe that will incite some change in legislation and other things. People will do more to protect Pennsylvania cemeteries. And besides the histories, we are working on an incomplete, it will never be a complete list of everyone who's buried there. And we're at several hundred. And we hope to do bios for as many of them as we can. I like cemeteries, and I like wandering through cemeteries and looking at the headstones and thinking about the lives of those people, and you can't do that there. So I want to make these people more than just a headstone. And with grad students and other community members, share these stories, because the people buried there were an integral part of our community, and they should be remembered, and you can't go into that space and just look at their headstones and remember them. So hopefully doing this in a digital format. We hope to include images of people if they exist, so reaching out and having community involvement. We have a couple at the society, but there's a lot we don't have. And maybe it'll be something from a pension record, because I believe there's about 40 USCT buried there. We do know that. Or maybe a picture of the house they lived in, if we know that. So it's in its infancy. And it'll be a multi-stage process, and we might not ever have bios for everyone, and we might not ever have a complete list for who else buried there, but I think it's important to do. And I'm excited that we can move forward with this and start telling that story. But I'm pushing this project forward, but this project is bigger than me, and it can tie into the Hallowed Grounds Project and other things that all the work you've done. So it's in its infancy, and it'll be multi-phases, but I'm really excited to be working on this and reaching out to the community when we get to that step, to help have people share about people, remember people that are buried there, or have heard stories, and gathering that. We want to gather stories from the people that remember this happening in the 70s, so we can capture that story as well, because I think that's important. Going through borough minutes and all of that. And the borough is on board and knows we're doing this. We are not doing anything physically at the site, but things are happening there as well. And we're going to have, the people that want physical changes will have updates on our website as well, so it'll all kind of be housed together. Yes?
I don't have a lot to offer yet, but Ms. Wanda Hunter and a few people from Borough Council, Tawanda Stallworth as well, are on a committee for looking at Lincoln Cemetery. The Army War College class of 2019 have offered a gift, a financial gift. They give a gift every year, and this year they decided to do one at the cemetery. So there is going to be a small investment, not insignificant, a nice arch that will say Lincoln Cemetery going from the park, the Memorial Park side to the cemetery, but that is not the end-all and be-all of it. We know that. I am only on council, I've only been on council for a year, but just as Kara said, this is something that I've been interested in. I mean, that headstone, the Jordan headstone, is Wanda's family's headstone, so there's lots of connections. What I can say from the borough is that we are trying to connect with the Historical Society. There are archives in the borough that they don't have access to, and we have folks looking, and we are looking for the story that you want, and we're not shying away from it. And we know that there's stories that we don't know. We don't know it either, and that's the problem. Because maybe someone back in the day did know all the pieces to the puzzle, we don't know it either. And so what I'm trying to do is work with some folks there to help uncover some of that information, and work with the Historical Society so we match those pieces up and have a proper timeline and understanding. It's going to take some time. There will be some sort of additional investment from the borough, but we want to make sure that it's not that there's any sort of reason to slow things down, but to look at what we have as a historical guideline and then make a thoughtful choice as to how we can try to do something. It's never going to fix the previous choices. But already I'm sure Kara has lots of interesting stories. Anyway, I can't give a lot of detail right now because it's all just starting, but we are trying, is what I can say. I know that's not a lot, but, and Ms. Wanda comes to all the meetings and do when you offer. Okay, so.
Thank you so much for that information. So what it appears to me is we're having different calls to action with a similar mission, right? I think what we've learned today from the panelists, it really articulates the need to pass on these stories, to preserve these stories, to be active citizens and informed citizens, And it takes a range of us, not just, older folks, but also the younger generation, like Tatyum. She's really setting a really great example. So I would like to thank all of the panelists for your great contributions to the discussion tonight. So can we give the panelists a hand? And I would also like to thank Lindsay for inviting me to be a moderator of the panel, and I really admire all the work that the Cumberland County Historical Society has done over the years, not only for the community, but also for Dickinson. We've used the archives on many occasions. And finally, I would like to thank you all for coming out and being a part of this discussion. Do you have one question?
Thanks to all the panelists and everyone who came out tonight. I wanted to just offer something to our community because I feel like hearing all of these stories and seeing all your faces in this room tonight, we have an opportunity. And I'm not from Carlisle originally. I only came here in 2000. So there are people in this room who have very deep history and very deep roots. I feel like we have an opportunity for some real healing and reconciliation in this community if we go about it sensitively and thoughtfully. Recently, there was a film that was done by a Dickinson student that told some of the story of what happened with the cemetery. And some of the footage was quite shocking. And there were people in the audience whose family members are buried in this place, in this holy place, that we saw bulldozers come in and clear. And it was, kind of traumatic to be in the room and see that, especially if it's your family members. And there have been many conversations about this in many different groups and many different circles. And I think there are a lot of people who are very concerned and who really want to help and who really want to see the best that can come of it at this stage. And I also know that many people who have come before the borough have felt not heard and put off, and it's been difficult. And I think that we have an opportunity to use this forum and your voices and our concerns to urge that the effort be led and moved forward by the families who have the deep roots and the actual stories, and be listened to and heard and supported. And I don't think it's going to be that hard to get photos and stories and backgrounds when we fully invite everyone into the process. So I just want to urge us to take this opportunity to go about it thoughtfully, sensitively, arm in arm together in a way that can bring about healing and reconciliation for our community. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. With that, again, I thank you all for coming out. It's a great note to end on.